Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Stein, founder and CEO of WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development firm specializing in live video applications. We're here to help you take your video application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. For today's episode of WebRTC Live, I'm very pleased to have Lorenzo Miniero, PhD, join us again. Lorenzo is chairman and co-founder of Meetecho, which is the consultancy behind the Janus WebRTC server. He's also a regular contributor to the IETF standards around WebRTC and joins us today from Naples, Italy. He'll be speaking at the IIT RTC conference in Chicago normally, but virtual this year in October on Can SFUs and MCUs Be Friends? But today he's going to talk to us about some interesting applications of WebRTC in broadcasting and studio productions. So welcome back, Lorenzo. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's really nice to be back.
Oh, always a pleasure. It actually was, it's been too long since we've spoken in this format. It was actually September of last year, which was officially 10 years ago, 1 year. Feels like 10 years ago. So a lot has definitely changed, but glad to be speaking with you again here. At that time, last year, we were talking about the upcoming Janus conference in Naples, which I was hoping to be joining you at in person very soon, but not to be this year. Do you want to start off just mentioning what your plans are for Janus conference this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely plan to have a second edition of JanusCon happening. It will be, of course, virtual because unfortunately we are all stuck at home one way or another. But we will have a virtual edition of JanusCon sooner or later. So we are not exactly sure when it will happen. So it may be in a couple of months, but it will definitely take place. So we'll definitely make some announcements when we have more information.
Okay. Great.
No virtual pizza, I'm afraid. So there's a limitation to what we can do with WebRTC, but we'll try to do our best.
Well, I have heard of some conferences sending like lunch boxes out to attendees. So if you would be willing to make a Naples pizza and send it to me here in Virginia, I will pay extra for that.
The issue is that pizzas need to be eaten as soon as they get out of the oven. So with shipping times, it can be a bit tricky, but we can try. I mean, experimentation.
That's right. That's right. Well, this is definitely a year for experimentation. So that actually brings us to a blog post you wrote recently about doing some experiments with NDI and broadcasting and how to do in-studio interviews with WebRTC. So maybe you can start, telling us a little bit about where this idea came from, and then whenever you like, if you want to share your screen too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The idea actually came out almost by, almost by chance, because I actually saw it mentioned on some Twitter threads. There was a discussion about broadcasting tools, WebRTC, NDI, and so on, and this happened a few months ago, and I remembered seeing this mention and thinking, it looks like a cool idea, so why hasn't anybody done that? And then, something else happened, I forgot about it, and then it came out during another discussion that I had with Dan Jenkins. So Dan Jenkins is the founder of Nimble Ape, and is also the mastermind behind the ComCon events, an event that is quite popular among WebRTC aficionados because it always hosts excellent presentations in unique locations. And this year they had ComCon, a virtual edition of ComCon too. And it was a peculiar event because they basically recorded all the contributions in advance, and then they presented them at scheduled times. So it had a different production approach compared to the traditional virtual events, let's say, which of course fostered an excellent quality for the media. And then, of course, this kind of production approach also meant that they had to approach it a bit differently in terms of how they would record conversations, edit them accordingly, and so on and so forth. And it was during this experience that with some chats that I had with Dan, they basically found out that they had some issues basically with using NDI streams and WebRTC sources together to actually do what they had to do, because there are some ways to actually take care of this, but they all have some quirks. Let's say they are not exactly friendly, or they have some limitations, or you have to use different tools at the same time. So it can be a bit of a headache. And so actually, before moving ahead, I should explain a bit what NDI is first, just to make sure that people are familiar with it. So I just prepared very few slides to mention this briefly, and I'll share my screen right now. Can you see that? Okay, it should
Not
be.
yet. There we go. It's loading now.
So basically, NDI is a de facto standard that was created by Newtek, that basically stands for Network Device Interface. So it's basically a protocol that these engineers came up with to basically allow broadcasters, producers to basically combine media sources that are not physically attached to your production environment. So let's say it's easy for us to plug a webcam via USB in our machines and use it to join a conversation like we're doing right now. But most of the times when you are in a production environment, you actually have sources that come up from different places. You have a server that hosts pre-recorded clips, or you may have remote participants, or you may have a lot of different things that are actually sitting in different places in your own private network. And so basically NDI allows you to use these remote media sources as a local source instead, so that in a production application that you have, you can combine these different sources, which can be a local webcam, a remote stream, or a file that is sitting somewhere, as all together in the same production environment, and combine them in order to produce, for instance, a TV show or whatever actually requires some more complex broadcasting approach. And it's actually a very popular tool among broadcasters. It actually became a de facto standard, and pretty much all tools out there now make use of it one way or another, just because it's very simple to use and it's so ubiquitous usually. Which is why it kind of surprised me that there are no easy ways to actually plug WebRTC and make use of WebRTC as an NDI source as well. Mostly because in this time and age, you see remote interviews happening all the time. So you see TV shows or CNN interviews. All of these shows are actually doing remote shows. So you have the host is remote most of the time, so all the participants are remote as well. And so you'd expect a technology like WebRTC to be used extensively in this case in order to facilitate people joining a conversation somehow, and then use NDI to allow the producer of the show to actually combine all of these streams in a way that makes sense for the show that is taking place. And that's actually not the case, or it's, let's say, partly the case, because there are some tools that allow you to do WebRTC to NDI, but most of them have some strict limitations, like they mixed all the streams in advance, so they don't give you the individual streams, which is something that most producers would need anyway, because they would need to have their own layouts and these kind of things, or they may be extremely expensive or have additional limitations. So, for instance, as far as I'm aware, Zoom doesn't have NDI yet, even though they may be working on it. Tools like Skype and Teams do have some sort of NDI support, but all have some sort of limitations here and there, and both are quite expensive for the people that actually need that. And there are other tools that, as I said, basically mix all the streams rather than giving you the independent streams, whether it's audio, whether it's video. Usually, of course, media producers would like to have access to the individual streams so that they can have much more control about whatever they need to do. Which is why I started thinking about how I could actually experiment with this a bit. So how I could myself take a WebRTC stream and then translate it to an NDI source instead, in order to allow people to do things a bit more creatively and with more freedom than that. Also because sometimes with the existing tools, you are also locked in with the technology itself. So you don't have complete freedom in, for instance, the kind of application that you want the NDI feeds to be used in. And which is why I eventually documented in this blog post the kind of approaches that I started working on. And so first of all, I started writing a simple tool that allowed me to get an incoming RTP stream and translate that to an NDI feed, which basically meant I created an RTP server application, a configurable RTP server application that could receive an audio and video stream. Then I would decode the incoming packets in the application itself, and then I would translate the raw frames that I decoded to the format that NDI was comfortable with. And of course, for the NDI translation itself, I made use of the NDI SDK by Meetecho, which is actually free to use and open source. So you just have to contact them to basically have access to the SDK, and then you can actually use it in your own application. So I started experimenting with this a bit, and so I just used some simple GStreamer-based pipelines to send some pre-encoded RTP traffic to my command line application, and then I used another application to receive the NDI stream, and this, to my surprise, worked quite nicely, quite fast. So it was actually a good sign for me. So I decided to move to the next step. So rather than having an external application dealing with that, I thought Janus does have an integrated RTP stack. We have a modular architecture to handle the streams however we want. So I thought I'll replace the RTP part with the Janus RTP stack that I already have available. I just need to take the decoding part and include it into a new plugin that I'm writing. And then I take care of the translation to NDI in the plugin itself, which is what I did in a first demo that you can see over here, where I had in the same private network, I had my own Janus instance over here. I had the user connecting to a page in my private network, and then this would be translated to NDI into an OBS stream itself. And this is something that I can show quickly in a small demo that I have available here. So if I open this demo page over here, this is running all on my laptop. So it has a relative use case, as we'll show later, but it's a cool way to test things. So I can publish as Lorenzo. Now I'm publishing my stream over here. I can open OBS, which is a popular tool among broadcasters and supports NDI as a way to inject media. So here I have a scene that has just the Meetecho logo as the background, which is an image that you see here of a source. So what I can do, I can add the new NDI source. And as you can see, I see now a stream available that is Lorenzo. So this all happens at the NDI level because they use basically multicast to advertise their available streams and so on. So OBS is immediately aware that there is this new stream. I can consume it, and here I am. Now I appear in OBS as an NDI feed, which means that I can then use all the OBS magic that I'm completely unaware of. So I really don't know anything about OBS, but I can move things around. I can create a nice scene, and I can do interesting things with it. But of course, as I was saying, this is only interesting relatively, because in this case, I'm doing a cool demo, but I'm doing everything in my own LAN environment. If I want to do an interview with the remote participants, I cannot have them join my private LAN. I have to have a server somewhere in the cloud, let's say, where I can have a conference room, and I can have the conversation there, and I have to implement some way of pulling these remote streams and then have them made accessible to the Janus instance in my own local setup so that they can become available as NDI feeds. That's because NDI also only works in a private network, of course, because that's where the production environment is. So it will be separated at the network level from the servers that may be on AWS in the cloud, for instance. And to make this thing work, I actually thought a bit of a trick initially. So that's basically using two different Janus instances. So I still keep my local Janus instance here with the NDI plugin, which is sitting in my private network. But at the same time, I have a public Janus instance where the conference room is actually taking place. So if I have a user connected to the public Janus instance, if I have some orchestration code that is aware of all people that join this conference room over here, all I have to do is basically set up WebRTC peer connections between these two Janus instances so that my local Janus instance acts as a passive participant and receives all the video streams that are being published on this public instance instead, which is basically the simple proof of concept orchestrator that I created. And initially, I just did it with the streaming plugin just for fun. But this is actually something that I then expanded a bit on. So I have actually a demo where I have a public video room instance running here, where we have a couple of people, few people joining in a conversation, and then we can consume these streams from the LAN Janus itself. And if you want, Ari, we can try to do a small demo to show how it works practically. So I shared with you a link before, so we can try to join this room over here. Okay, here we are. So we are now duplicated. We are now chatting in two different rooms, which is a very WebRTC developer kind of thing to do. So now, actually, I have my Janus instance that has subscribed to both streams, which means that if I now open OBS again and try to open the NDI source, I now see the both of us here. So I can try to put my video here, and I can put your video here as well. And of course, it's not just audio and video. It's not just video. Video is, of course, immediately apparent, but the audio is actually being shared as well, which is, of course, an important part of the broadcasting experience. And now here you see video changing resolution, because this is WebRTC doing its job and adapting the bitrate and bandwidth depending on CPU consumption, available bandwidth, and so on. And in this case, my poor laptop is struggling in sending so many streams at the same time. And so, of course, there are tricks in OBS to basically force the resolution to be fixed. So in this case, it's changing dynamically, but there are ways to make sure that it always is, for instance, like this. And so basically, there are tools that allow producers to have much more control over the whole experience. But I'm pretty much a noob when it comes to OBS. It's just fun to experiment with this a bit.
Yeah.
So now I'll stop this just to make sure that my laptop never doesn't die too soon. Then we can get back to the presentation itself. So basically, that was the main outcome that I got out of this prototype. So basically now it kind of works. I also did the same demo at the last ClueCon, virtual ClueCon that happened. And in that case, we had about 5-6 people chatting with each other. I showed how you could combine the multiple videos together. And I also had OBS broadcast the result to YouTube, which was kind of choppy because my laptop, of course, struggled a lot in sending media via WebRTC, a screen share via WebRTC, then encode live to YouTube as well. But it was quite fluid in my own instance as I was watching OBS. So it was just a matter of not having a strong enough machine. But definitely this was a cool thing to experiment with. So yeah. I think I can stop sharing my screen also because I didn't have much content that I wanted to present here. I just thought it might be interesting to chat a bit about this with you instead, also because it is actually a new use case that I think would actually be quite interesting to see WebRTC be used in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I have a few questions for you around that, but first I want to get to a couple of questions we have from our live viewers here. So first, the LAN version of Janus, that is getting each, just confirming for Jared in our chat here, that gets each of our streams was delivered to that individually. So it's not a composite of that, correct?
Yeah, because the Janus by default doesn't have any MCU functionality. So this was the video room in use. And so the video room uses an SFU approach where all the audio and video streams are served separately. So in that case, yeah, I had my Janus instance subscribing to the two different streams separately, which is how I could then generate two different NDI sources at the same time. So if this had been mixed, then in that case, I would only have had a single NDI source to be used in there, which means that it would have been up to the producer to then do some cropping magic to make sure that it could basically separate our two videos to do something with them. Having access to the separate videos instead made it much easier to do.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the power of this, right? Is that this is, I think about where would we use this, and there are a couple of different use cases, right? If in a standard meeting tool, you don't need this sort of control, right? And in a lot of webinar tools, you don't necessarily either, right? We're doing this episode of WebRTC Live with BigMarker, and the RTC conference coming up, we'll be using Hopin for doing that conference virtually. So there's a lot of tools that give you kind of that enclosed, contained experience, right? If you're looking for kind of a webinar type of experience, you can find a number of tools using WebRTC to do that. The value in this is where you really want to have that more granular control over our individual video feeds and those cool tricks that OBS gives us, right? That, we could be with the Meetecho logo behind us as you were talking. We could have fancy overlays, and we can have any kind of graphics that we want in there. And there's a great old episode of Saturday Night Live, by the way, that maybe you've seen before, where they just keep putting overlays at the beginning of the cable news era. And so you could put all the overlays you want through OBS and have that type of control that you're not going to have in one of the sort of shrink wrapped tools, which is part of the power of this. Now, back to a couple of questions that we have from viewers here. So a couple of questions around, will you be sharing the code for any of this? Is this going to be commercial? Is this going to be open source? And how far have you gone beyond the prototyping versus willing to share some of the code around this?
Yeah, to be honest, we don't know yet. So we are still evaluating a bit the interest in all this. And besides, while this works nicely already, and we've seen it in action in a real world scenario. In this case, you connecting from the US, I connecting from a completely different place, and everything kind of worked. It still needs some work to become a bit more robust and to iron out some issues here and there. So we definitely need to fix some things before we make a decision. We are currently a bit more oriented towards the commercial approach versus open source, even though I am an open source guy. So there may be some form that may be shared as open source sooner or later. I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. So we are still evaluating a bit our options. I'm also chatting with Dan, which, as I mentioned, is the guy that actually brought the idea in the first place, because we are thinking about working together on some of these aspects. So we'll definitely have a clearer idea in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense and sounds great. Yeah, so in this example, you're using Janus for the video server in this. You could do this. The same concepts, someone could do this without Janus and with other WebRTC clients. So we have a question here from Sumit asking, instead of using the LAN Janus, is it possible to use any WebRTC client, say a browser, to ingest the RTP and then convert it into NDI?
I think that for the public part, you probably don't want to change much. So it should still be browsers communicating with a public server somehow, because that's the easiest way to have the conversation in the first place. And that fits in the way that online conversations happen anyway. What can definitely change is how do I pull these streams that are taking place remotely? How do I pull them in my LAN and do something with it? So in my case, it was easy for me to use Janus as a client in this case, because I had Janus acting as a subscriber to all of these streams rather than a server. So it was mostly acting as a client thanks to my orchestrator code. So in that case, it may make sense to have a dedicated WebRTC client stack, so that doesn't have the overhead of a whole server, that can basically connect to a server where the conversation is taking place, receive the streams via WebRTC, and then take care of the translation to NDI. So that's definitely something that is possible. It's something that I haven't done yet, mostly because it was much easier for me at this stage to just use Janus, also because it made it easy for me to control the whole process. And also because Janus itself has a WebRTC stack that is ready for me to use. So any new attempt would mean that I would have to reuse or adapt some of the existing stacks. So for instance, I could use WebRTC bin by GStreamer to pull the videos, but then I would have to hook it up to something that is my RTP to NDI code in order to then take the decoded video and convert it to NDI instead. So there are different approaches that can be taken. So for the LAN, for pulling stuff from the LAN, there are different approaches that can be used for sure.
Yeah. And for that local Janus server, we have another question from Akil here asking, could we use a Raspberry Pi as the local Janus server?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is also one of the things that we started wondering about when it came to how would we distribute this in case it became something commercial, for instance, because it could be an instance that you install somewhere on a server that you have, or it could be very simply a Janus instance on a Raspberry Pi that you plug in your network, you configure somehow, and then everything runs from there. So it's basically a tiny server that has all that it needs in order to do the job. So Janus can definitely be installed on Raspberry Pis. We've done it multiple times. There have been people that have actually used it also as a way to do remote controllable cameras, for instance. So there are different ways that you can use Janus on a Raspberry Pi, and I think that this would be a very easy way to use these, to integrate these very quickly into a setup that is already available. So without you having to install physical servers or virtual servers, you just plug an additional component in your setup and it should work. So it's definitely possible. We haven't tried it yet. So the issue here would mostly be the throughput management, because something that I haven't mentioned is that NDI has a very high quality, but it also has a very high throughput usage, which is why it only works on LAN environments. So I haven't done any actual estimation of the traffic itself, but if I recall correctly, we are around 50 megabits of video per stream and something like this. So the moment you have multiple people in the conversation and you have to generate multiple NDI sources for the same conversation, this may take a bit of a toll on whatever application, whatever server you are using to actually stream the content. So the Raspberry Pi may not be able to stream as much content in real time on the LAN, but this is all speculation at the moment. It's just things that we are thinking about.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing about this of translating from WebRTC to NDI essentially is that those as I understand it, those problems could basically be passed off to the local network at the production studio, where they're used to having, walls of monitors in a TV studio and lots of local equipment, but their remote users or their remote interview subjects or journalists or whoever, they don't even have to have the Skype client downloaded or something like that, like many of them are doing. They're going to a URL connecting purely over WebRTC. So we're bringing all that burden and flexibility into the production studio with an architecture like this, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, and we've had a number of comments also made in here, people just reaffirming that they love how this would be able to give them separate control of those NDI streams in each. So I think you're definitely spurning a lot of encouraging a lot of creativity with this, Lorenzo. Another question from Akil here asking about Reconnections. So if I lost my WebRTC connection while you're interviewing me and streaming it, through OBS, would the producer have to re-add that stream in OBS? How do you foresee that working?
Yeah, for how it works right now, I basically tied the WebRTC peer connection lifecycle to the NDI source itself. So basically, the moment that I get a new peer connection, I'm creating a new NDI source. The moment that peer connection goes down, I remove that NDI source. So, and that's basically just to keep things clean, because I don't know if it will be an orphaned source. I don't know exactly how it will be used. But of course, this is exactly where the some feedback from people much more used than I am with NDI would be excellent, because in that case I would know how people typically use these sources and so on. Because if I know that having an NDI source always available is preferable, and then you just feed it when, for instance, a peer connection goes down, a peer connection comes back, and you start feeding the same NDI source and that still works, that would basically mean that I can change a bit the way the plugin works in order to accommodate that part as well. So right now, if the connection drops down and the NDI source goes down as well, and so yes, you would have to re-add things. But of course, since it's code and we can basically do whatever we want with it, this is something that can definitely be changed if there is a good scenario that actually explains it might make sense.
Sure, that makes sense. It may depend on the use case, the workflow that you want in those situations. Okay, great. And we have another question here, and we'll be wrapping up this episode soon. So anyone else watching, if you do have other questions, make sure you get them in now in the chat in big marker there. And by the way, we have several people also indicating that they'd be happy to help beta test this for you, Lorenzo. So again, I think this has been a really cool topic. Tony asks, wouldn't it be easier to implement RTSP to SRT instead of RTSP to NDI? This way you can ingest SRT from the Janus public instance without the need of the local Janus instance.
Yeah, so we haven't used SRT much, but in general, the issue with this is that, I mean, the main motivation for this effort in the first place was trying to make it as easy as possible to use for generic people, which is why WebRTC made sense, because it's something that you can just use with the browser. So the moment you involve technologies like SRTP in there, it means that you may have to start using some native applications as well, either on the user side, or I mean, and in some cases it makes sense, because it may be you may have different production environments talking to each other, and so you may have more control over the remote setup. In most cases, though, when you actually want general people talking to each other, so just in making a conversation with somebody from their home, it just makes sense to use WebRTC instead. And so that's why I basically use WebRTC all the way, mostly because that's what Janus supports and is strong for. So I mean, there are definitely different approaches that can be taken. So even RTSP typically requires a native application itself, because browsers typically don't support it. So some mobile applications can, but it's not as widely deployed as it is right now, apart from some specific use cases. So I just tried to make it as easy as possible for the random Joe on the internet to use it, basically.
Sure, absolutely. No, that makes sense. All right. So I'm curious, Lorenzo. I know that one of the interesting things this year in our work at WebRTC.Ventures is we're certainly receiving more interest from people looking for different types of broadcast applications. So whereas I would say maybe a couple of years ago, in the earlier days of WebRTC development, we're certainly building lots of meeting tools, and maybe somebody wanted a webinar tool. But now we certainly are getting leads from people looking for more sophisticated broadcast-related applications. And because of the pandemic and stay-at-home and social distancing orders, they are looking for ways to change aspects of the production process. And this is a great example of one. How do you connect with those remote interview subjects easier? So I certainly have seen a good amount of extra interest and change in this field due to the pandemic specifically. But in your work with Janus and at Meetecho, you've been working with events longer as well. So I'm curious, do you see this particular, do you think without the pandemic you would have identified this need around NDI specifically? Is this something that is due to the pandemic and how it's changed our workflows and our lives? Or is this maybe an example of just how, as WebRTC continues to evolve, we're starting to think of more interesting and unique use cases for it beyond, say, a meeting tool?
Yeah, I think it actually sits a bit in the middle. So, because for sure NDI was used with communication tools for a while already. So you mentioned Skype, for instance, and there has been an NDI plugin for Skype for quite some time, which means that people actually had a need for something like this for a while, and they just didn't think of WebRTC as a requirement for that at the time. And I'm sure that the pandemic definitely accelerated a requirement for that. And the main use case is that the moment that it became this remote interviews approach became even more ubiquitous than usual, then it became much more of a requirement, because basically any kind of CNN or public news interview had to be remote somehow. All talk shows would have to be remote as well, which is why it pains me so much to see that Conan O'Brien, for instance, uses Zoom, because I love Conan and I'm not much of a much fun of Zoom in the first place, while, for instance, Jimmy Kimmel uses WebEx and this kind of tools. So you see how all of these very, let's say, much more popular TV shows and popular entertainment or not shows and so on started involving a lot of remote participation in the first place, basically added a lot of stress to the producers to actually make sure that they could actually implement it effectively and in a professional way every day. So that for sure, I think, accelerated the things a bit, because what you could live up with in the past, so some quirks here and there with the existing applications and so on, became much more of a hassle the moment that you had to use them every day, the whole day, and so on. So it meant that you had to start thinking about different approaches. It meant that you started noticing some things could be done better. You started noticing that you could benefit from having, for instance, separated streams rather than having them mixed, or having a simpler way to invite people in than using some native applications and so on and so forth. So it's definitely a mix of the two, I believe. But yeah, I'm afraid the pandemic played a considerable role as well.
Yeah, it's certainly been an accelerator, at least for ideas that, even if they would have been uncovered previously. I'm a big fan of Conan O'Brien too, by the way, and so I'll recommend you listen to the podcast, and then you don't have to visibly see that they're using Zoom, and that might be easier. You might be able to enjoy it better that way. Yeah, I think it's interesting, certainly, to see how all of this has affected different industries, and the events industry, TV, film production. These are some of the things I've been blogging about recently on WebRTC.Ventures about how the pandemic has changed virtual events. So certainly encourage our viewers to check that out at WebRTC.Ventures. Lorenzo, of course, has an excellent blog as well, Meetecho.com, and where he blogged about this NDI tool recently as well. Yeah, while we're on the topic of meeting tools, I'll mention to our viewers as well, one of the blog posts I need to write soon is probably going to be titled something like Meeting Tools That Don't Begin with the Letter Z. So I'd love to help Lorenzo and I feel better about the meetings that we have to be on all the time, encourage more people to use some of the WebRTC-based tools out there. So feel free to send me your favorites. You can add us on Twitter at WebRTC.Ventures with what your favorite WebRTC-based meeting tools are, or reply to the comments on the YouTube video when we post the recording of this particular WebRTC Live episode as well. Lorenzo, this has been a great conversation, and appreciate you taking the time, and everybody who's joined us live and asked a lot of great questions. Any other closing thoughts that you have, or announcements you want to make? Anything you want to touch on?
No, not much. I mean, I'm just really happy to have had this conversation as well, because I was really looking forward to this, also to show a bit the work that we've been doing under the curtains for a while. I'm happy to have that a lot of people showed interest and made some excellent questions. So that provided for some very useful feedback. And it's always nice to see you as well. So I was happy to come back.
Well, let's definitely do it again sooner than next September. Let's make this more than an annual event. I'll see you at the RTC conference soon. For those watching, the Illinois Institute of Tech Real-Time Communications Conference registration is open for that. It's free. There's going to be a lot of great speakers on WebRTC, including Lorenzo, at that conference that's coming up the week of October 10th. And you could go to rtc-conference.com to register for that. Also, a couple of upcoming WebRTC Live episodes I want to mention to you. On September 23rd, I'll be speaking with Alan Quayle from TADHack, which is excellent telecom applications developer hackathons. He'll be doing one in coordination virtually with the IIT RTC conference. And on September 28th, we'll be speaking with Sean Dubois from PyOnLee, again about specifically this time, not so much about the Pion project, although you should definitely check that out too, but his efforts around WebRTC for the curious and an open source WebRTC book and documentation effort that he's leading. And so, yeah, thanks again for joining us today. Thank you again, Lorenzo. Enjoyed it. We'll post this video to YouTube soon, and if you want to keep up with future events like this, just follow us on Twitter at WebRTC.Ventures. Join our email list at WebRTC.Ventures. Lorenzo, you want to plug a couple URLs? Where can people find out more about you and your work at Janus?
You mentioned already Meetecho.com, which is our main website, and from there you can get access to, of course, to the Janus repository, which is completely public. It has some demos available. The code is completely available as well, and so some documentation. So if you want to learn more about Janus in the first place, that's an excellent starting point, and it's also where the blog is. I don't blog there as often as I'd like, but when I do, I hope I provide some useful information as I did this time. So please get in touch. I'm also available on Twitter as well if you want to learn more.
Perfect. All right. Thanks again, Lorenzo. Thank you all for joining us. Let's make it live.